Good evening to you from Carroll County. It is tonight's DELPHI debrief, and we have a very special guest with us tonight, a very educated guest on this topic, I would say, too, Amy Graham McCarty from the Carroll County Comment. Welcome. We're glad that you're with us tonight. We are filling in for Bob and Emily, of course, election duty calls, so we're excited to be filling in for them tonight. We have a lot to talk about, but maybe first just tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you've been very in on this case really from the beginning.
Yeah, so thanks, Samantha. I started covering this back in the beginning when I was working at another newspaper in Indiana. Being from this area, I grew up in Wabash, lived in Peru where my husband's family still resides for several years. And after traveling around as a journalist, came back to Indiana and was in Monticello for several years with Hoosier Media Group, which is owned by Don Hurd, and covered it exclusively for all of our newspapers throughout the state of Indiana. My husband's a pastor, and so we moved to Illinois, but when Don purchased the Carroll County Comment, he brought me back to relaunch the newspaper, and I've just continued covering the case ever since for him. So for me, it was only natural to come back here and see it through to its completion.
Well, we're glad you're here, and thanks for
you.
helping us debrief everything that happened on today, which was day 16, Tuesday here in Carroll County. And I think what we'll do first is just kind of run through the list of who we heard from today, the key witnesses that the defense called, like we said, on day 16, and then we'll kind of go into some of the detail because there was new information today.
Yes.
There was a lot of technical information, and we want to make sure you understand everything that happened. So let's put this up on your screen. We'll start with this first. The first witness we heard from today was a woman named Betsy Blair. She claims she visited the bridge the day the girls went missing. She says she was actually there a couple times. Not the first time we've heard from her. We'll talk more about that in just a second. Followed by today, Dr. Stuart Gracian, who is a psychiatrist. A lot of technical testimony we heard from him today regarding Richard Allen's mental state. We'll get into that. Then Dr. Eric Warren, a forensic scientist who talked a lot about firearms and crime scene reconstruction and what that looks like specifically with this case. And then lastly today, Stacy Eldridge, a digital forensic examiner and consultant, and what the process looks like. And that's where we learned more about this new information, new digital data that we'll get into first. Let's start at the beginning, if you don't mind, Amy, talking about Betsy Blair. Like you said, you've been covering this from the beginning. You were there a few days ago when we heard from Betsy the first time. So kind of walk us through who she is and then a little bit of what she talked about.
So Betsy Blair is one of the witnesses who claims to have seen what has been known now as Bridge Guy. She frequents the trail. She walks there often. She said on February the 13th that she visited the trail and was there for an extended amount of time. She likes to do 3 loops is what she had said. So she did 2 loops. She left for about 30 minutes and then returned to the trail. It was then that she walked towards High Bridge. And when she got towards High Bridge, she has testified that she saw a man standing on the first platform. She said he looked at her but wasn't really expecting her. He was like he was looking for someone else, she said. She turned around and walked back the other way and returned to her car and then left. What they talked about with Betsy today, as the defense has now called her as a witness, was the vehicle that she may have seen when she left the trail. In fact, they didn't even talk to her about who she saw on the bridge that day. And so she claims that at the former CPS building, she saw a vehicle. She said that vehicle was parked unusually, meaning that she said it was close to the building and it was backed in. Most people just pull in and park. However, what's different from what we have heard before from other witnesses is Betsy says it was an older model sedan. It was very square. And in fact, they entered into evidence a drawing that she drew for police, and it was very square looking. She said it resembled an older car that she remembers her dad having back in the 60s. She said it was not bright in color. She could remember that, but she couldn't remember specifically what color it was. And the defense did try to have her read from her transcript from April 2nd, 2019, to see like what color was it specifically. And she says, in 2019, I said it could not have been black. Why is that important? Because police say that Richard Allen's 2016 Ford Focus SC hatchback was on County Road 300 North the day that the girls went missing. And to fit in that timeline, that black vehicle needs to be traveling on the road at that time or be parked in that area. So that's kind of what she talked about. Now, Andrew Baldwin, defense attorney, did ask her if she thought the car that she saw that day was a hatchback, and she said she couldn't see the back of the car because it was backed in. But yeah, that just kind of is a rundown of what she said. Now, I think it's important to note that on cross-examination, Deputy Prosecutor Stacey Diener did ask her about another car that we have heard testimony about. That was an older model sedan that was parked about 2 feet off the road on County Road 300 North on the side closest to the highway. And she asked her, could that have been the car? And Betsy said she's not 100% certain if it could have been that. And what I think Diener was getting at, or what Stacey Diener was getting at, is did you maybe see that car on the road and not at the CPS building? But we never really got a concrete answer on that. With Betsy.
And keep in mind, of course, for any of these folks who are talking, right, we're talking about a memory or an instance that was more than 7.5 years ago at this point.
Yeah.
But to her point, she said, you know, what caught my attention about this vehicle in the first place was that, like she said, she passed through that area pretty frequently. She was familiar with the area, but this one vehicle that was parked a little different, up close to the building, kind of caught her attention, enough for her to remember it and talk about it moving forward. So,
and that's not the first time we've heard that. If you go back in some of the statements that have been released from other witnesses over the years, a lot of them say they saw a car backed in. And so I think that that's something that has stayed congruent through all of it as well.
Moving on to this next one, the next witness that the defense called today was Dr. Stuart Gracian. This was interesting, and you and I talked before on camera just about how impressive his resume was.
Yes.
A psychiatrist, not from the area, originally lives out in Boston, has several degrees, went to Harvard Medical, serves as a professor and instructor at times too. Very intelligent, very good credentials coming into this. And one thing that was very important to mention specifically when it comes to this case is his areas of interest, right? And he talked about solitary confinement being one, memory being another, and then false confessions. And of course, when you're thinking about the Delphi case specifically and maybe how all three of those tie into Richard Allen and his experiences. And one of the quotes that this witness shared was, quote, "It's important to understand the mental state in cases like this." And then this is when he really kind of goes into what he talks about, having watched some of the videos, having listened to phone calls, read transcriptions of Richard Allen's time in confinement. And some of his findings were pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think, again, important to note, he did not personally assess Richard Allen. He used documentation from Dr. Walla. He used the report from Dr. Polly Westcott, who the defense had called as an expert witness in neuropsychology, to come to his conclusion. And so as he was getting ready to testify, the state entered a motion in limine to restrict his testimony. And so basically, they didn't want him to testify specifically to any potential facts of Richard Allen's conditions in the jail because he never saw those. Right. He didn't personally meet with Richard Allen, and so they wanted to be very careful about that. Stacey Diener had mentioned that with Dr. Polly Westcott, she had perhaps made some statements that she shouldn't have. And she should have, in fact, Stacey Diener even said she should have known better for the number of times that she has testified as an expert. And she basically said, you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
Right.
And so I think that was very important coming into his testimony as well, as the state was being very careful about what they allowed in.
Yeah, so they raised those concerns actually right off the bat this morning. The judge allowed this doctor to testify anyway, so we heard from him. And once he really got into the core of what he studies and specifically what he's seen when it comes to this confinement, when it comes to making false statements, he kind of got into what he considered the common symptoms of an extended period of time in solitary confinement. And I just want to read you some of these because I think they're interesting. He talked about people who are in there for a long period of time being confused, not having memory, not knowing where they are, being hyper responsive to stimulation if they receive stimulation at all, even high rates of suicide, delirium. But then he named more specific details like smearing feces. He said, oddly enough, that's a very common situation when we're talking about folks like this, and being naked. And the reason we bring up those two was because from what we understand, jurors saw videos of Richard Allen in similar situations. So again, he did not specifically see Richard Allen. He never visited Richard Allen, but just describing some of these common symptoms that sound like what he experienced.
Yes, yeah. I think that, again, you know, you question how much information did he have going into this. Obviously, these were things that he read in a report on Richard Allen. But if those are indeed symptoms of delirium, symptoms of severe cases, then Richard Allen has exhibited that.
Yeah, and he specifically asked, when I say he, we're talking about defense attorney Brad Rosie, he said to this doctor, he said, so you listened to some of these calls, you read some of the transcriptions, I'm going to ask you point blank, did you notice symptoms of delirium in Richard Allen? To which he responded, absolutely yes.
Yes.
That was
Classic,
telling.
not a doubt. Yep, he did.
So then we go on to hear more from him. We hear a little bit of cross-examination. And again, something that we've talked about before on some of these Delphi debriefs is the questions from the jurors and how detailed and specific they can be. And we heard from one juror, a couple of them actually, they asked really good questions to this doctor. They said, can psychotic behavior go back to normal once you've been removed from one of these situations? And he responded, generally, yes. Another juror asked a similar question, do you believe normal can become psychotic after 6 months? And what they mean by that is, do you believe a normal person, if put into this situation where there's extreme conditions, can become psychotic after 6+ months? To which he responded, absolutely, I've seen it. So again, interesting testimony that in this case backs up one of the defense's theories that Richard Allen's mental state was deteriorating when he made those confessions in prison to killing Abby Williams and Libby German.
Yeah. You know, I think it is important to note, too, with this jury, they're smart.
Very smart.
They ask really good questions. They ask a lot of questions. A lot of people have been commenting about how can they do that? I've never heard of a juror being able to ask a witness a question. But it is under the jury rules, under Indiana law, that they can do that. And so when they ask the questions, the witness answers, and then both sides, the defense and the state, have an opportunity to follow up with additional questions of their own.
Yeah, and it's pretty straightforward.
It is. It really is.
And it's been good to hear. I think it shows everyone in the courtroom that they are listening, that they are involved, and they are asking those questions. Moving on, shall we, to our next one. This next one was interesting, and it was perhaps one of the longer ones of the day. This time we're talking about Dr. Eric Warren, working specifically with firearm crime scene reconstruction and what that process looks like, but more specifically what it looks like to this case. And of course, a lot of the conversations around this case have been about this cartridge, right? Some people calling it about this bullet. Talk to us about what you took away from some of the things he shared.
So a lot of what Dr. Warren shared were his experiences with firearm and tool mark identification. And so he's looking at several things. 3 categories that he specifically mentioned were individual marks. And these are marks that are specific to a firearm, whether it be some type of issue within the firearm, if it's been damaged, if it can cause a specific striation mark, which are like scratches on it, or what he calls an impression. The other thing that he's looking at is subclass. And so subclass are marks that can be made on a cartridge or a bullet, a casing, that come from a manufacturer flaw. This is not the first time I've actually heard this type of testimony. I covered a murder in Ohio perhaps 7 or 8 years ago, and a similar testimony was used about a gun. And they talk about how in the milling process, or as these firearms, and it was actually specifically a Sig Sauer as well, when they're made in the factory, they cut them off at each end. And so there's a specific tool, it's cutting here, it's cutting here. And so as they go down the line, you're going to see similar, perhaps, marks. Not exact, but you could see similar. The insides of the gun, if you will, the extractor, the slide, some different parts are often made at other facilities. And so it's not a send it down the assembly line, everything is exactly the same. They kind of put all these parts into a box, as Warren described it, and then they pull them out, and an individual physically puts the gun together. And so, but because of some of this milling process, you can have what is called a subclass of characteristics. So it's something that you might find on other firearms. He did say that when firearms are shipped, they kind of just put them all in a big shipment and they send them out. So firearms sent to northwest Indiana, northern Indiana, central Indiana are going to perhaps have similar subclasses compared to firearms that are in Florida, for instance. So I thought that was interesting. That was one of the other types of characteristics that he talked about.
Yeah, and of course, to back us up a little bit, what this whole conversation is surrounding, we know at the crime scene, in between the girls, was what we've been talking about,
Yes.
right? People have been talking about this. The exact words, the quote from court today was, "this cycled, unfired round collected at the scene." That was a quote from the prosecutor today. And it was interesting to hear this scientist, as he called himself, explain and be somewhat critical of how the state initially handled its examination of this. And so talk to us a little bit more about, he kind of looked at photos, right? We saw photos that were shared today, and how he explained that that was a hallmark example of some of this. Talk to us about that.
Right. So one of the things that he said can happen is that when you photograph a cartridge underneath a comparison microscope, and so we know that Dr. Melissa Oberg had testified that, and she's the Indiana State Police forensic examiner who did an analysis of the cartridge found at the scene and compared that to Richard Allen's gun that was recovered during a search warrant of his home in October of 2022. She talked about similar striation marks, right? So these were marks on the cartridge that she found, we'll say inconclusive when she chambered it, meaning that it was cycled, not fired. Mm-hmm. Once she fired that through Allen's weapon, she said that she was able to make sufficient agreement, meaning that she could say that this came from this gun, this cartridge came from this gun. But what we heard from Dr. Warren today was that that's not really a fair assessment. That's apples and oranges, not apples to apples. We've heard this exact statement from the defense multiple times as we've talked about this cartridge. But they pulled up one of the defense exhibits that showed photographs of the striation marks on the cartridge, both from a test cycled in from the fired cartridge and then the cycled cartridge. And they're similar, but you can tell they're not matching up directly because there's just not enough pressure. And so we've heard that before. The different things can contribute to the pressure of the cartridge and what makes the marks. And one of the things that he said is that when you photograph this cartridge under the light of the microscope, you get divots, and those are highlighted. And so a mere shift one way or another could change that. And so that's one of the reasons I think that he was pretty critical of Melissa Oberg's findings, is that, again, it happened with this microscope if it had changed a little bit. But what he did say is what he could see on the cartridge were, and he said, hallmark examples of subclass indicative of what I would expect to see in subclass markings on the cartridge.
Yeah. And it was interesting, too, you mentioned him being critical of the initial handling from the state police. And I think, too, he talked about not documenting. And he said so many of the things that maybe could have been documented just weren't documented, so I'm not sure how to respond, or I'm not sure how to take that because it simply wasn't included or wasn't reported in the first place. And he was asked about that. He said, if you were to have been doing this, would you have documented all this? And he pretty much said, yeah, I would have, and I wish it would have been there so that he could have had a more thorough look at that initial state report.
Right. But again, just like the doctor who testified earlier today about solitary confinement, he did not examine the cartridge physically. He's taking all of his information based on reports that he has read. And the jurors asked a really good question. They asked him, why didn't he write a report? Why didn't he examine it? And he basically said, I wasn't asked.
Right.
I was asked to come in and evaluate and determine if sufficient agreement could be made based on Melissa Oberg's reports, and I did not find sufficient agreement. But again, he didn't run the test himself. Interestingly enough, he said had he run the test, it may have gone either way.
Right.
He may have found sufficient agreement, or it could have stayed the same and he could have said that there wasn't sufficient agreement. So again, it's almost a neutral point, if you will, because he didn't physically examine the evidence himself.
Yeah, and it was interesting to hear him say, basically I came in to do the job that I was asked to do.
Yes.
If I would have been asked to do more, I could have done more, but I came to do my job,
Yeah.
and that's what he did.
Exactly.
So our fourth witness we heard from today gave us the most, what I would consider to be new information.
Absolutely.
And perhaps some of the most talked about information of the day. Like we told you earlier, this was from Stacy Elridge. This was interesting to talk about the phones and the digital data surrounding this case. There have been a lot of discussions about that.
There have.
And today we heard from an expert who, again, has years of experience. She worked with the FBI as a senior forensic examiner, working with some of this digital data. And she was here today to talk about the data that was pulled from state police from Libby German's phone. And of course, that's important because you'll remember that's where we got the video
Yes.
and the audio from Bridge Guy, of Bridge Guy. And so now we're hearing from this investigator, this examiner, who's saying, yeah, I looked at this data, and yeah, I can appreciate some of the data that's here, but I actually found more.
Right.
And she showed us, talk to me about that. She put up this data set on the screen for the entire courtroom to see, and she really walked us through what she found, which was interesting.
Right. So what she says is that Libby's phone showed at 5:44 in the afternoon that something recorded plugging into the headphone jack. And then that same cell phone recorded at 10:32 p.m. that evening that it was unplugged. She can't say specifically what it was, but she said typically these findings would be a headphone jack. But here's the other interesting, she said, and these are her words, a millisecond, right? A millisecond before something was inserted into that headphone jack, Libby's phone rang. She received a call. So that's information that we didn't have before at all. There's also been a lot of questions, even a juror question on how does that happen, right? Because we know that Libby's phone was found underneath a shoe, underneath the body of Abby Williams at the crime scene. So how does it get plugged in? That's the big question.
Yeah, that's the first time we had heard of what sounds like another person with or manipulating that phone. And it was also interesting to hear, and we had this witness show us, right? They brought one of the old iPhone 6S's. They had the old headphone jack, and she showed us what that process would have looked like. And I think it was also interesting when the defense pointed out, if someone's calling your cell phone, and maybe your sound is on, right? You can audibly hear it ringing.
Right.
When you plug in that headphone jack or whatever was plugged in, that cuts the audio.
It does.
So if Libby's phone would have been ringing for the room to hear, when you plug that in, it would have stopped.
Right.
And so it was interesting to see her actually show us that. And this examiner was talking about how when she's pulling some of this data, in her words, she said she's getting under the hood, right? And she explained several levels of data that she's able to pull, from basic surface level stuff all the way down to, it was, in her words, stuff the user can't touch and can't control. Something that Libby or whoever was using this phone would have no control over, she's able to pull. She claims state police in that initial data pull did just the bare minimum. And from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, we didn't get that full report and full gather of the data until October of that year.
Right, and if I heard testimony correctly today, this information perhaps that she discovered was on that full data pull.
Right.
So First Sergeant Chris Cecil with the Indiana State Police wasn't aware of what that the breakdown of the numbers and the information meant at the time. And he later testified to that today, that he just wasn't aware of what that was.
And outside of this headphone jack conversation too, something else that this witness brought up that was interesting was she was talking about this full extraction, like we mentioned, in October of 2017. And she said, I went back and I looked, and one of the key cases of what she called was missing evidence that concerned her was what she called the current power log.
Right.
And that's basically the inner workings of your phone that document every time it goes on and off. And the more it goes on and off, the more it loses data and the more information that's dropped. And she said, that could become an issue if you're dropping files, if your phone gets older, just as it generates too. And that was concern for her.
It was, because we know that the phone was off when it was found at the scene. It was powered on so that the Indiana State Police could try to pull some immediate data, which was the basic pull, photos, videos, messages, that type of thing. It then powered off again, powered back on, and there were at least 2 different times that they attempted to extract data from the phone. And what she says, like you said, is that every time those files fall off, and not only that, but the older the phone gets. So between February 17th and October of that same year, older data is going to start to fall off.
Yep. So she goes through, we hear a little bit more too about the health data app on Libby German's phone. That's to have captured movement on her phone, right? And she went into more details about, if the phone were in a car, would the health app record? Or if the phone was off, would the health app be recording movements? To both, she answered no. But again, the phone was essentially, off the record, was essentially tracking no movement from around 2:30 that afternoon on February 13th, basically for the rest of the phone's life. And that was something that they talked a little bit more about. The prosecution asked a few more questions about that too. But I thought this part was interesting. When the defense asked her, she said, okay, so if the phone was stationary, if it was at the crime scene this whole time, why would it disconnect from cell towers in the area for hours, for most of the night, and then suddenly reconnect again at 4:33 a.m. the next morning? And this witness said, well, I didn't find any evidence in the digital data that shows what may have gone wrong. So she says, I believe something external happened.
Right.
Either the phone was moved or service was blocked. At that point, the prosecution kind of pushed back and said, okay, but have you been to the scene? Do you know the cell service here in Carroll County? Do you know the cell service of that specific day and time? Basically alluding to the fact that, is it more logical that maybe that phone just lost service for all that time?
Right, and Prosecutor McClellan said, calls can go in and out. You could be sitting right here with your phone, and you can go in and out of service. Sure. And she agreed that that's possible. She's seen it happen. Yeah. And so he was alluding to the fact that Libby's phone could have gone out of service just came back on at 4:33 in the morning.
So we heard she was on the stand, a couple hours?
Yes.
A couple hours this afternoon. That was the second witness of the day we had seen on the stand for several hours. And again, I stepped out right before this point so we could make sure we were on 13 News this afternoon, but you stayed for jury questions.
Yes.
And I think, again, going back to what we talked about earlier about the detailed questions that are coming for some of those jurors.
Yeah, so the jurors asked 11 questions of her. That's a lot. I don't think it's their most. I think we had 13 another time, but 11 questions is a lot. And just a quick rundown, they asked her if she wrote her own report on her findings. Again, she did not extract the data from Libby's phone personally. She reviewed reports. And so she said because of limited time, she did not. And that's the second time we heard her today talk about the limit of time. We don't know why that time was limited. We know that she was paid roughly $300 an hour for her services as an expert witness by the defense. That is not unusual that either side would pay for an expert witness. We don't know if that's why or if it was for other reasons, but she did mention that time was an issue. Another juror asked if the information that was pulled, this Knowledge Seed database, could have been synced to Libby's iPad. We know that she had an iPad that she used. And she said, I don't believe there was any syncing between the devices. This question actually was really interesting. One of the jurors asked if water or moisture could affect movement of the phone. We know that the girls were taken across the creek. A forensic pathologist had testified, and multiple Indiana State Police CSIs testified that the clothes that Abby was wearing were wet. There was a water line. And she said she didn't know. But the follow-up question, remember, attorneys can ask follow-up questions. Nick McClellan then asked her, would water affect the headphone port? Now, she said it wouldn't at that time, but we're going to learn in a little bit from First Sergeant Cecil some possible contradictory information that he found compared to that. They asked if someone could have put something into the port to scramble the signal so that the phone wouldn't come up with any information. And then they asked an interesting question, which was not related to her testimony at all, and that was, could you have analyzed Richard Allen's phone to see where he was during those hours? And she said yes. And I found that, like, that's something that, we think, why didn't that happen? Well, remember, in evidence that was collected during the search warrant, there were about 12 phones and 2 beepers from Richard Allen's home. But the phone he was using in 2017 was never recovered. And so police have not analyzed that phone. So it begs the question, if they could analyze the phone, what would they find out? And would that information contribute to Richard Allen's innocence or to his guilt?
So this was towards the very end of the day. This was all just after 3:30, around 4 o'clock. Quickly, though, after we heard from the jurors' questions, we did, like you mentioned, we heard from 2 gentlemen during the rebuttal from the prosecution. And then the defense actually called up these 2 gentlemen, right? Talk to us quickly about what we learned there.
So the defense called Indiana State Police First Sergeant Chris Cecil, and also they called up, and I want to get his title right, Lieutenant Brian Bunner. Both gentlemen analyzed the phone. Lieutenant Bunner analyzed it very early in the investigation. First Sergeant Cecil did the further extractions using Cellbrite and other information, and actually pulled new information as of August of this year. And so what Jennifer Auger for the defense asked him was, did he know about this audio output start? She said, do you know what that is? And he said, no. And she said, can you, in your expertise, say why or how it happened? And he said, no. Well, then Prosecutor McClellan comes up and asks him on cross-examination, did you research this information? And Chris Cecil said, actually, yes. After hearing that juror's question and Nick McClellan, following up, he did a Google search. And in that Google search, he found websites that talked about troubleshooting your audio output port. And in there, he said that it said water damage or dirt could cause the phone to register a headphone being plugged in when it is not. Why does that matter? Because the phone was found, McClellan followed up with, under a shoe, under the body of Abby Williams in the dirt.
Yeah. And near the water.
And near the water,
right.
Yes. So
interesting. Okay. So today, kind of like we said at the beginning, today was very technical,
Yes.
it felt like, on a couple different fronts. A lot of key parts and conversations of this case felt very technical today. We're expecting more tomorrow. Like we mentioned, today is day 16. Tomorrow will mark day 17. I'm curious, as someone who's followed this from the beginning, do you have any expectations for tomorrow? Or perhaps more importantly, we're nearing the end of this, right? What about the timeline moving forward? Do you have any predictions?
So this is kind of my prediction of how it will go. I feel that the defense will probably wrap up sometime before lunch tomorrow or right after lunch. We know then that the state will have an opportunity to offer some rebuttal witnesses. I could really see us wrapping up possibly as early as the end of the day tomorrow,
Okay.
coming in with closing statements on Thursday, Friday morning at the latest, and the jury going to deliberate before the weekend. So it could be that we have a verdict before the weekend comes. This would end the trial almost a week earlier than they had anticipated. And Judge Gall did say during jury selection that both parties has indicated we could end early. I think something to note is that the jurors actually have had an opportunity to discuss the case throughout. They've not had to wait until deliberations to discuss it. The rule is all 15 have to be together. And as long as all 15 are together, they can discuss. If one person is missing, they cannot. So we have to ask, are they starting to kind of formulate in their minds what they're thinking, what direction they're heading in terms of a verdict?
Yeah, and like you said, the original timeline of this case was through next Friday, through November 15th. So if things were to wrap up this week, like you said, it'd put us about a week ahead.
Yes.
We have no indication, no timeline on jury deliberation, what that could look like. But to your point, maybe they're having some of these conversations already. So we'll see. We'll see
Yes.
what tomorrow brings, what the days ahead bring. Thank you, Amy, for
Thank
being
you
with
for
us.
having me.
It's a lot to break down. It's good to have multiple perspectives because, again, like we've mentioned on here, no cameras allowed in the courtroom.
Right.
So it's just Amy and I and all of our notes, right?
right.
So
That's right.
we will continue, of course, to follow this both here at WTHR and with our friends at the Carroll County Comment. We anticipate much more developments in the days to come, and we'll have you covered. So we'll send it back to you guys for now. We'll see you again tomorrow.